The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard as Master Takeshi moved through his kata with practiced precision. His white gi rippled with each controlled movement, every strike cutting through the air with a sharp whistle that echoed off the ancient walls. At 42 years old, he had dedicated his entire life to the martial arts, earning black belts in multiple disciplines and respect from students across 3 continents. His dojo in the heart of the city had become legendary, producing champions and teaching discipline to thousands over the years. Takeshi had received an unusual invitation 3 weeks earlier. The royal family of a small European kingdom was hosting an international cultural exchange, bringing together masters of various traditional arts, calligraphers, tea ceremony experts, swordsmiths, and martial artists from around the world were being invited to demonstrate their crafts at the palace. It was an honor that came once in a lifetime. Takeshi had accepted without hesitation. The journey to the kingdom had been long but enlightening. The small nation nestled between mountain ranges had preserved its monarchy and traditions in ways that felt frozen in time. Ancient castles dotted the landscape, and the people moved with a formality that seemed to belong to another century. When Takeshi arrived at the palace gates, he was struck by the grandeur of the stone fortress that had stood for over 800 years. Inside the palace walls, preparations for the cultural exchange were already underway. Artists and craftspeople from dozens of countries were setting up their displays in the vast courtyard. Takeshi was assigned a space near the eastern wall, where the afternoon sun would provide perfect lighting for his demonstration. He spent the first day arranging mats, setting up boards for breaking demonstrations, reviewing his planned routine. The palace guards were an imposing presence throughout the grounds. They wore traditional uniforms that included deep blue coats with gold braiding, tall black boots, and ceremonial swords at their sides. Their faces remained expressionless as they patrolled, maintaining order and security with silent efficiency. Takeshi noticed how the other visitors gave them a wide berth, speaking in hushed tones whenever a guard passed nearby. On the second evening, Takeshi was invited to a reception in one of the palace halls. Crystal chandeliers illuminated rooms, filled with priceless artwork and furniture that had been crafted by master artisans generations ago. He found himself in conversations with a Japanese calligrapher who had been practicing his art for 60 years, an Italian violin maker whose instruments were played in concert halls worldwide, and a Persian carpet weaver whose works hung in museums. During the reception, Takeshi observed the royal family from a distance. The king was an elderly man with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor, while the queen carried herself with elegant grace. Their son, the crown prince, appeared to be in his 30s, and Takeshi noticed how carefully the guards positioned themselves whenever the prince moved through the crowd. Security was clearly paramount, though it was handled with such subtlety that most guests barely noticed. The demonstrations were scheduled to begin the following day. Takeshi woke before dawn, as was his custom, and made his way to the courtyard to practice. The palace was silent, except for the distant footsteps of guards making their rounds. He moved through his warm-up routine, feeling the familiar burn in his muscles as his body prepared for the physical demands ahead as the sun rose higher. Other participants began to arrive. The courtyard slowly filled with activity as each artist prepared their space. Takeshi could hear the soft scraping of calligraphy brushes, the gentle tapping of a silversmith's hammer, and the quiet conversation of early visitors who had been granted access before the official opening. The first public viewing began at 10 in the morning. Crowds of invited guests, dignitaries, and members of the press filled the courtyard. Takeshi started his demonstration with basic kata, explaining through a translator the philosophy behind each movement. He spoke about balance, control, and the mental discipline required to master the martial arts. The audience watched with genuine interest, many of them seeing authentic karate demonstrated for the first time. As his demonstration progressed, Takeshi moved into more advanced techniques. He broke boards with precise strikes, demonstrated defensive maneuvers, and showed the speed and power that came from years of dedicated training. The crowd applauded after each segment. He could see the appreciation in their eyes. It was during the afternoon session that everything changed. Takeshi was in the middle of a complex sequence, demonstrating a series of high kicks combined with spinning movements. The Crown Prince had arrived in the courtyard with his security detail, positioning themselves near Takeshi's demonstration area to watch. The guards formed a loose perimeter around the prince, maintaining their vigilant watch while trying not to obstruct the view of other guests. Takeshi began a particularly challenging routine that required complete spatial awareness. He executed a spinning back kick, his body rotating through the air with controlled power. As he completed the spin and extended his leg in a side kick, something went catastrophically wrong. One of the royal guards, a tall man with a stern face and rigid posture, had stepped forward at precisely the wrong moment. The impact was immediate and unavoidable. Takeshi's heel connected solidly with the guard's chest, the force of the blow enhanced by his spinning momentum. The sharp crack of the strike echoed across the suddenly silent courtyard. The guard stumbled backward, his face contorting in pain and shock as he fought to maintain his balance. His ceremonial sword clattered against his belt, his hands grasped at his chest, where the kick had landed. Time seemed to freeze. Takeshi's foot returned to the ground, his stance automatically shifting to a neutral position, even as his mind reeled from what had just occurred. The crowd gasped collectively, and conversations died mid-sentence. Every eye in the courtyard turned toward the scene unfolding before them. The struck guard finally steadied himself, his face now flushed red with a mixture of pain and what Takeshi recognized immediately as humiliation. The man's jaw clenched tight, and his eyes blazed with an emotion that made Takeshi's stomach drop. Around them, the other guards had tensed, their hands moving instinctively toward their swords. The casual atmosphere of cultural exchange evaporated in an instant, replaced by a tension so thick it felt suffocating. Takeshi raised his hands in a gesture of peace and apology, his mouth opening to explain, to apologize, to somehow undo what had just happened. But before he could speak, the guard he had struck took a menacing step forward. The man's face was now twisted with rage, and Takeshi could see his hands trembling as they formed into fists at his sides. The Crown Prince stood frozen, his eyes wide with surprise. Other guards began moving toward the scene, their movements purposeful and coordinated. Takeshi realized with growing horror that this was not going to be resolved with a simple apology. He had just struck a member of the royal guard in front of hundreds of witnesses, including the Crown Prince himself. In this traditional kingdom where honor and protocol meant everything, the consequences could be severe. What happened next would change everything Takeshi thought he knew about honor, tradition, and the true meaning of strength. The courtyard remained deathly silent as the struck guard glared at Takeshi with undisguised fury. Sweat began to bead on Takeshi's forehead, though not from physical exertion. His years of training had prepared him for many situations, but nothing like this. He had faced opponents in tournaments, defended himself in street confrontations during his youth, and taught countless students how to handle conflict. Yet standing in this ancient palace courtyard, surrounded by armed guards and foreign dignitaries, he felt more vulnerable than ever before. The guard took another step forward, his breathing heavy and labored from the impact. Takeshi could see the man's chest rising and falling, and he felt a wave of guilt wash over him. The kick had been powerful, delivered with the full force of a technique he had perfected over decades. The guard was clearly in pain, though his pride would not allow him to show the full extent of it. Around them, the other participants in the cultural exchange had backed away, creating a wide circle around Takeshi and the guards. The Japanese calligrapher Takeshi had spoken with at the reception stood with his brush frozen mid-stroke, ink dripping onto the parchment below. The Italian violin maker had set down his tools, his weathered hands clasped together nervously. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The captain of the guard, a barrel-chested man with silver threading through his dark hair, pushed through the circle of onlookers. His medals clinked softly against his uniform as he moved with deliberate authority. His face was unreadable, hardened by years of service and trained to reveal nothing. When he reached the scene, he surveyed the situation with cold, calculating eyes. Takeshi immediately bowed deeply, the gesture, automatic and sincere. In his native language he began to apologize, though he knew most present would not understand his words. The translator assigned to him rushed forward, her face pale with fear as she stumbled over the translation. Her voice shook as she conveyed Takeshi's profound regret and explained that the contact had been entirely accidental. The captain raised his hand, silencing the translator mid-sentence. He turned to the struck guard and spoke in their native tongue, his voice low but carrying absolute authority. The injured guard straightened despite his obvious discomfort, responding with clipped, formal words. The exchange lasted less than a minute, but to Takeshi, it felt like an eternity. Then the captain turned his attention to Takeshi. His eyes were like chips of ice, betraying no emotion. Through the translator, he informed Takeshi that striking a member of the royal guard was a serious offense, regardless of intent. The laws of the kingdom, some dating back centuries, were very specific about such matters. Takeshi felt his legs weaken slightly, but he maintained his composure. Keeping his gaze respectfully lowered, the crown prince finally stepped forward, and immediately all the guards snapped to even more rigid attention. The prince was younger, up close, than Takeshi had realized, perhaps only 30 years old. With thoughtful eyes that seemed to take in every detail of the situation, he spoke quietly to the captain, who listened with absolute focus before responding with a formal bow. A conversation ensued between the prince, the captain, and several other officials who had materialized from within the palace. Takeshi stood motionless, his mind racing through possibilities. Would he be arrested, deported? Would this incident spark some kind of diplomatic issue between his country and this kingdom? He thought of his students back home, of his dojo, of the reputation he had spent a lifetime building. After what felt like hours, but was likely only 10 minutes, the captain turned back to Takeshi. Through the translator, he announced that Takeshi would be escorted to a private chamber within the palace. His belongings would be collected, and he was to remain in that room until the matter could be properly addressed. The captain's tone made it clear this was not a request. 2 guards stepped forward, positioning themselves on either side of Takeshi. They did not touch him or draw their weapons, but their presence was unmistakably that of an escort for a prisoner. Takeshi nodded his understanding and began walking in the direction the captain indicated. Behind him, he could hear the murmur of shocked conversation beginning to ripple through the crowd. The walk through the palace corridors was surreal. Takeshi found himself noticing details with strange clarity, the way stress sometimes sharpens the senses. He saw the grain in the wooden panels that lined the walls, noticed how the afternoon light filtered through stained glass windows to paint colored patterns on the stone floors, heard the echo of their footsteps, creating a rhythm that seemed to match his racing heartbeat. They climbed a spiral staircase that seemed to wind endlessly upward. The guards remained silent, their expressions neutral as they guided him higher into the palace. Finally, they reached a heavy wooden door reinforced with iron bands. One guard produced an ancient-looking key and unlocked it, pushing the door open to reveal a small but comfortable chamber. The room contained a bed with clean linens, a table with 2 chairs, a washing basin, and a narrow window that looked out over the palace grounds. It was certainly not a dungeon, but the lock on the door made the situation clear enough. Takeshi entered without protest, and the door closed firmly behind him. He heard the key turn in the lock, followed by the receding footsteps of the guards, alone for the first time since the incident. Takeshi allowed himself to sit heavily on the edge of the bed. He put his face in his hands, replaying the moment over and over in his mind. He had been so focused on his demonstration, so committed to showing the precision and power of his art, that he had failed to maintain complete awareness of his surroundings. It was a fundamental error, one he would have immediately corrected in any of his students. As the afternoon wore on, Takeshi meditated, attempting to calm his mind and prepare himself for whatever judgment was to come. He thought about the principles he had taught for so many years: respect, humility, awareness, control. He had preached these virtues countless times, and now he had failed to fully embody them at the most critical moment. A knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. The lock clicked, and a palace servant entered, carrying a tray of food and water. The servant, an older woman with kind eyes, set the tray on the table and gave Takeshi a sympathetic look before leaving without speaking. The food was simple, but well prepared, though Takeshi found he had little appetite. As evening fell, painting the room in shades of orange and purple through the small window, Takeshi heard footsteps approaching again. The door opened to reveal the captain of the guard, now accompanied by an official-looking man in formal robes who carried a leather document case. The captain's expression remained unreadable. As he gestured for Takeshi to stand, the official opened his case and removed several papers, spreading them on the table. Through careful formal speech that the translator relayed with obvious nervousness, he began to explain the legal situation. The kingdom's laws regarding assault on royal guards were indeed ancient and severe. Under normal circumstances, such an offense could result in imprisonment, substantial fines, or even deportation with a permanent ban from the kingdom. Takeshi listened with growing dread, his worst fears seeming to materialize before him. But then the official's tone shifted slightly. He explained that the crown prince had personally reviewed the situation and had taken several factors into consideration. The incident had clearly been accidental, occurring during a sanctioned cultural demonstration. Takeshi had immediately shown remorse and respect. Most importantly, the struck guard himself had provided testimony about what he had observed. The guard, whose name Takeshi learned was Henrik, had admitted that he had stepped into the demonstration area at an inappropriate moment. While this did not excuse the contact, it provided important context. Henrik had also stated, somewhat grudgingly, according to the translator's tone, the technique itself had been executed with remarkable skill and control. Despite the force of the impact, it suffered no serious injury beyond bruising and wounded pride. The official paused, letting the translator catch up, before continuing. The crown prince had made a decision. Takeshi would not face criminal charges or deportation. However, there would be consequences and conditions. The matter was too serious and too public to simply dismiss without any response. Takeshi felt a surge of relief mixed with apprehension about what these conditions might entail. The official began outlining the terms, his formal language making each point sound weighty and significant. Takeshi would be required to remain in the palace for an additional week, beyond the planned cultural exchange. During this time, he would meet with Henrik and other members of the royal guard. The specific purpose of these meetings had been left deliberately vague, which made Takeshi uneasy. Additionally, Takeshi would be required to write a formal letter of apology to be recorded in the palace archives. He would meet personally with the crown prince to present this apology. Only after fulfilling all these requirements would he be permitted to leave the kingdom. The official rolled up his papers and returned them to his case. The captain of the guard spoke for the first time since entering, his voice gruff but not unkind. He informed Takeshi that a different room would be prepared for him, one more suitable for a guest than a detainee. Tomorrow morning, the first of the required meetings would take place. Henrik had requested to speak with Takeshi privately. The captain strongly suggested that Takeshi approach this conversation with complete honesty and humility. After they left, Takeshi sat in the gathering darkness, processing everything that had been said. He felt grateful for the prince's mercy, but deeply uncertain about what lay ahead. The requirement to meet with Henrik filled him with a complex mixture of apprehension and, surprisingly, curiosity. What could the guard possibly want to discuss? An apology had already been given and accepted in principle. What more was there to say? That night, sleep came slowly. When it finally arrived, Takeshi's dreams were filled with spinning kicks that never quite landed, with opponents whose faces he could not see, and with doors that locked and unlocked in endless succession. He woke several times, disoriented in the unfamiliar room, for dawn finally broke across the kingdom. Morning arrived with a soft knock on the door. A different servant, a young man this time, entered to inform Takeshi that he was being moved to new quarters. The room he was led to was dramatically different from the locked chamber of the previous day. Located in the guest wing of the palace, it featured a spacious sleeping area, a private bathroom with modern fixtures that seemed incongruous with the ancient architecture, and large windows overlooking the palace gardens. Fresh flowers had been placed on a desk, and his belongings from his hotel had been neatly arranged throughout the room. The improvement in accommodations did little to ease Takeshi's nervousness about the upcoming meeting with Henrik. He performed his morning exercises in the room, moving through familiar kata to center himself. The movements helped calm his mind, though he found himself being extra careful not to extend any kicks too far. Hyper-aware now of the space around him in a way that felt both appropriate and slightly traumatic. Breakfast was brought to his room, along with a note written in elegant script. The meeting with Henrik would take place at 10 o'clock in one of the palace's private training rooms. The location choice seemed significant, though Takeshi was not sure what to make of it. He ate slowly, forcing himself to consume the meal despite his lack of appetite. Whatever was coming, he would face it with as much strength and clarity as he could muster. At precisely 10 o'clock, a palace attendant arrived to escort Takeshi through the labyrinthine corridors. They descended several flights of stairs, moving into older sections of the palace where the stone walls were bare and the air smelled of age and history. Finally, they reached a heavy door, which the attendant opened to reveal a large room with high ceilings and polished wooden floors. The space was clearly a training facility, though not one in regular use. Wooden practice weapons hung on the walls, their surfaces darkened with age. Padded mats were stacked in one corner, and the walls bore the scars of countless training sessions from decades past. In the center of the room stood Henrik, dressed now in simple training clothes rather than his formal guard uniform. Without the imposing uniform, Henrik looked different. He was younger than Takeshi had initially thought, perhaps in his early 30s. His build was athletic and strong, the physique of someone who maintained rigorous physical training. The bruising on his chest was visible where his training shirt hung open at the collar. Dark purple and blue marks that made Takeshi wince internally with guilt. Henrik dismissed the attendant with a curt nod, and the door closed, leaving the two men alone in the cavernous space. For a long moment, neither spoke. Henrik studied Takeshi with an intensity that was difficult to interpret. It was not the anger of the previous day, but something more complex. Something Takeshi could not quite identify. Finally, Henrik spoke, his words slow and deliberate as he worked through the unfamiliar sounds of Takeshi's language. His accent was thick, but his meaning was clear. He had been learning the language in preparation for this conversation. Wanting to speak directly without the barrier of a translator, the gesture surprised Takeshi, who felt a surge of respect for the effort. Henrik began by stating a fact that Takeshi already knew well. The kick had been powerful and precise. Then Henrik said something that Takeshi did not expect. In his 30 years, Henrik had trained extensively in the combat traditions of the kingdom. He had fought in training exercises, faced challengers, and tested his skills countless times. Never had he experienced a technique delivered with such speed and force. The kick had penetrated his defenses before he even knew it was coming. Takeshi started to apologize again. Pes Henrik raised his hand to stop him. That was not why he had requested this meeting. The humiliation of yesterday, Henrik explained, had been difficult to bear. To be struck down in front of the crown prince, in front of his fellow guards, in front of hundreds of witnesses, had wounded his pride deeply. He had spent the night wrestling with shame and anger, but Henrik had also spent the night thinking about the technique itself, the precision of it, the power behind it, the years of training that must have gone into developing such skill. As a martial practitioner himself, Henrik recognized mastery when he encountered it. Even when that encounter came in the most unfortunate of circumstances, Henrik walked to the center of the training room and gestured for Takeshi to join him. His next words came slowly, as he carefully arranged the unfamiliar syllables. He wanted to understand, not just the technique that had struck him, but the philosophy behind it. The training methods, the discipline required to reach such a level of skill. The royal guard, Henrik explained, were good fighters by the standards of the kingdom. But they trained in traditions that were centuries old, methods that had remained largely unchanged since the days of swords and cavalry. Takeshi began to understand what was being asked of him. This was not about apology or punishment. This was about knowledge. It's about the exchange of understanding between two martial artists who had met in the worst possible way, but who shared a common respect for their craft. Takeshi agreed, and over the next hour, he began to demonstrate the fundamentals of his art. He showed Henrik basic stances, explaining how proper positioning created the foundation for power and balance. He demonstrated striking techniques, breaking down each movement into its component parts. He spoke about the philosophy of his training, about discipline and respect, about the mental aspects that were just as important as the physical ones. Henrik proved to be an attentive, intelligent student. He asked questions that showed genuine understanding. And when he attempted to replicate the techniques, his military training and natural athleticism served him well. He made mistakes, as all beginners do, but he learned from each one quickly. The bruising on his chest clearly pained him when he moved, but he pushed through the discomfort with the determination of a dedicated practitioner as they worked. Something remarkable happened. The tension that had existed between them began to dissolve. They were no longer the man who had struck and the man who had been struck. They were simply two people who understood the dedication required to master a martial art. Sharing knowledge across the boundaries of culture and language, when they finally paused for water, Henrik's expression had transformed completely. The anger and humiliation were gone, replaced by something that looked almost like excitement. He explained that he had already spoken to the captain of the guard about what he wanted to propose. If Takeshi was willing, Henrik wanted to arrange for him to work with the royal guard during Takeshi's remaining time at the palace. The guard trained every morning from 6 to 8. Their methods were traditional and focused primarily on sword work and formation fighting. Henrik believed they could benefit tremendously from exposure to different techniques, different training philosophies. He had convinced the captain that this would be a valuable opportunity, one that might never come again. Takeshi felt emotion tightening his throat. What had seemed like a disaster just 24 hours ago was transforming into something entirely unexpected. He agreed immediately, honored by the request and humbled by Henrik's willingness to look past the incident. Over the next several days, Takeshi rose before dawn to join the royal guard in their training courtyard. The captain had been skeptical at first, watching with arms crossed and a stern expression as Takeshi introduced himself to the assembled guards. But as the training sessions progressed, even the captain's rigid demeanor began to soften. Takeshi taught them about flexibility and speed, about using an opponent's momentum against them, about the importance of breath control and mental focus. The guards, in turn, showed him their sword techniques and formation strategies. They shared the history of their fighting traditions, stories of famous guards from centuries past who had defended the royal family against genuine threats. Henrik became Takeshi's primary training partner, an unofficial assistant. Despite the painful bruising that was slowly fading from his chest, Henrik threw himself into the training with complete dedication. He translated instructions when Takeshi's words were not understood, demonstrated techniques alongside him, and helped bridge the cultural gap between the Japanese karate master and the European royal guards. The other participants in the cultural exchange would witness the original incident, watch this development with amazement. The Japanese calligrapher mentioned to Takeshi one evening that he had been certain Takeshi would be expelled from the kingdom in disgrace. Instead, he had become something of a celebrity within the palace. Guards who were off-duty would sometimes watch the training sessions, and palace staff spoke admiringly about the karate master who had turned a moment of disgrace into an opportunity for learning. On the 5th day of training, something extraordinary happened. The crown prince himself appeared at the morning training session. The guards immediately snapped to rigid attention, but the prince waved them at ease. He had come, he explained, through a translator, to observe the training that he had heard so much about. For the next hour, Takeshi conducted the session with the prince watching from a shaded area at the edge of the courtyard. He worked the guards through combinations of traditional karate techniques and their own sword work, showing how certain principles of movement and balance applied across different fighting styles. The guards performed admirably, their respect for both Takeshi and their own captain evident in every movement. When the session ended, the prince approached Takeshi directly. The translator rushed to keep up as the prince spoke. He commended Takeshi not just for his martial skill, but for his character. The prince explained that he had been watching the situation carefully from the beginning. The initial incident could have gone many different ways. Takeshi could have become defensive, could have blamed Henrik for stepping into the demonstration area, could have allowed pride to dictate his response. Instead, the prince said, Takeshi had shown true humility and had turned a negative situation into something positive for everyone involved. The prince gestured toward Henrik and the other guards, noting how their skills had visibly improved in just a few days. More importantly, they had been exposed to new ways of thinking about their art, new perspectives that would serve them well in their duties. The prince then made an unexpected announcement. The formal letter of apology would still be required, as it was important to maintain proper protocol. However, the prince wanted to add something to the palace archives alongside that apology. He wanted a detailed record of the training methods Takeshi had shared, so that future generations of the royal guard could benefit from this knowledge. Additionally, the prince wanted to commission a demonstration. On the final day of the cultural exchange, which had been extended by several days due to the popularity of all the programs, Takeshi would give a joint demonstration with Henrik and selected members of the royal guard. They would show how different martial traditions could complement each other, how cultural exchange led to mutual growth and understanding. Takeshi bowed deeply, moved beyond words by the honor being bestowed upon him. What had begun as his worst nightmare was becoming one of the most meaningful experiences of his life. As the prince departed, Henrik approached with a wide grin, the first truly unguarded expression Takeshi had seen on his face. They clasped hands, the gesture transcending the need for words. The final days before the demonstration passed in a blur of intense preparation. Takeshi worked closely with Henrik and 5 other guards who had been selected to participate in the joint demonstration. They trained for hours each day, developing a routine that would showcase both the traditional techniques of the royal guard and the karate methods Takeshi had introduced. The challenge was to create something that honored both traditions while clearly showing how they could enhance each other. Henrik had become more than just a training partner. In the evenings, after the formal sessions ended, he would often join Takeshi in the guest quarters, and they would talk for hours. Henrik's grasp of Takeshi's language had improved remarkably. Aided by his genuine interest and natural aptitude for learning, through these conversations, Takeshi learned about Henrik's life as a royal guard, about the honor and burden of serving the crown, about the weight of tradition that both preserved and sometimes limited their training methods. Henrik, in turn, was fascinated by Takeshi's journey in the martial arts. He listened intently as Takeshi described his early years of training. The countless hours of practice, the tournaments won and lost, the evolution of his understanding from purely physical technique to the deeper, philosophical aspects of his art. Henrik was particularly interested in how Takeshi had built his dojo, how he had translated his personal mastery into the ability to teach others. One evening, Henrik confessed something that clearly cost him effort to say. When the kick had landed, in that terrible moment before the pain and humiliation set in, there had been a flash of something else. Recognition in that split second. Henrik had felt the presence of true mastery, had understood in his body what his mind would take longer to process. He had been struck by a technique perfected over decades, delivered with a precision that his own training had not prepared him to defend against. That recognition, Henrik explained, was what had driven his request to learn from Takeshi. Pride had demanded that he be angry, that he seek some form of retribution, or at least distance himself from the source of his embarrassment. But his deeper commitment to his art, to becoming the best protector he could be for the royal family, had overridden his wounded pride. If such techniques existed, if such a level of skill was achievable, then he needed to understand it. Regardless of how that understanding had been forced upon him, Takeshi was deeply moved by this confession. He shared his own revelation, that the incident had revealed a flaw in his own training. He had become so focused on the demonstration itself, on showing the beauty and power of his art, that he had allowed his awareness of his surroundings to narrow dangerously. A true master, he explained, must maintain complete awareness at all times. His failure to do so had created the entire situation. This admission created an even deeper bond between them. They were both practitioners who understood that mastery was not a destination, but a journey, that every failure contained lessons, and that pride could be both a motivator and an obstacle to growth. The captain of the guard, who had maintained his stern demeanor throughout most of the training, began to show signs of appreciation for what was developing. He attended every training session now, watching with analytical eyes as his guards incorporated new techniques into their repertoire. One morning he pulled Takeshi aside and, with obvious difficulty, expressed his gratitude. He explained that he had been resistant to change, protective of traditions that had served the guard for generations. But he could see now that tradition and innovation were not enemies. The best traditions, he said, were those that could adapt and incorporate new knowledge, while maintaining their core values. As the day of the final demonstration approached, excitement built throughout the palace. Word had spread about the unusual collaboration between the foreign karate master and the royal guard. The guest list for the demonstration had expanded far beyond the original cultural exchange audience. Nobles from across the kingdom had requested attendance, along with foreign diplomats, military officers, and martial arts practitioners from neighboring countries. The night before the demonstration, Takeshi sat down to write his formal letter of apology. He had been provided with special parchment and ink, and his words would be recorded in the palace archives permanently. He wrote in his native language, knowing it would be translated for the official record, and he chose his words carefully. He wrote about the incident itself, taking full responsibility for the lack of awareness that had allowed it to happen. He apologized directly to Henrik for the pain and humiliation caused. He apologized to the Crown Prince for the disruption to the cultural exchange and the disrespect shown, however unintentionally, to the institution of the Royal Guard. He apologized to the captain and the other guards for creating a situation that threatened the dignity of their service. But Takeshi also wrote about what had followed, about the extraordinary grace and wisdom shown by everyone involved. He wrote about Henrik's courage in choosing growth over resentment, about the prince's fair judgment and vision in seeing opportunity within crisis, about the captain's willingness to allow tradition to evolve. He concluded by stating that he would carry the lessons learned in this kingdom for the rest of his life, and that he hoped the techniques and philosophies he had shared would serve the Royal Guard well in their noble duty. The morning of the demonstration dawned clear and bright. The courtyard had been specially prepared, with seating arranged in a wide circle around a central performance area. Banners bearing the royal family's crest hung from the palace walls, and musicians had been positioned to provide traditional accompaniment to the demonstration. Takeshi and the guards had arrived early to warm up and run through the routine one final time. They moved through the sequences with a precision that came from hours of dedicated practice. The routine they had created was ambitious, beginning with traditional Royal Guard sword formations, then transitioning to demonstrate how karate techniques could complement and enhance their defensive capabilities. The finale would feature Takeshi and Henrik performing a carefully choreographed exchange that would showcase both styles at their highest level. As the audience began to fill the courtyard, Takeshi felt his nervousness transform into focused energy. This was what he had trained for his entire life, though he could never have predicted the circumstances. He looked at Henrik and the other guards, seeing in their faces the same focused determination. The Crown Prince arrived with his parents, the King and Queen, and the audience rose in respect. Once the royal family was seated, the captain of the guard stepped forward to introduce the demonstration. He spoke about the unexpected circumstances that had led to this moment, and Takeshi was surprised to hear the captain speak openly about the initial incident. Rather than glossing over it or treating it as an embarrassment, the captain framed it as the beginning of an important journey. The demonstration began with the guards performing their traditional formations. Their movements were crisp and unified, the product of years of training together. Swords flashed in the morning sun as they executed complex patterns that had been refined over centuries. The audience watched in respectful silence, appreciating the skill and discipline on display. Then Takeshi stepped forward, and the demonstration shifted. He moved through a kata that demonstrated the fundamental principles of his art, each movement flowing into the next with liquid grace. His strikes cut through the air with audible force, his stances solid and balanced. When he completed the kata, he began to break down specific techniques, showing how they could be applied in defensive situations. Henrik and the other guards then joined him, and this was where the demonstration became truly unique. They showed how karate techniques could enhance their defensive capabilities when protecting a member of the royal family. Henrik played the role of a protected dignitary, while the other guards demonstrated how incorporating strikes, blocks, and movement patterns from karate could create more effective protective formations. The audience leaned forward in their seats, fascinated by this synthesis of traditions. Military officers and attendants took notes, recognizing the practical applications of what they were seeing. The foreign martial arts practitioners watched with professional appreciation, understanding the difficulty of merging different fighting systems in a coherent way. The finale approached, and Takeshi and Henrik moved to the center of the performance area. What followed was a carefully orchestrated display of both styles. Henrik began with sword techniques, moving through attacks and defenses that showcased the Royal Guard's traditional training. Takeshi responded with karate techniques, demonstrating how empty-hand methods could defend against armed opponents. They moved together like dancers, each technique flowing into the next, the exchange building in speed and complexity. At the climax of the exchange, they performed a sequence that deliberately echoed the original incident. Henrik stepped forward, as if guarding someone, and Takeshi executed the spinning kick that had started everything. But this time, Henrik was ready. He shifted his position, deflecting the kick with a technique he had learned during their training sessions. The movement was fluid and natural, showing how training had transformed a vulnerability into strength. The audience erupted in applause, and Takeshi saw genuine smiles on the faces of the king and queen. The crown prince stood, and the applause redoubled. The captain of the guard's stern face had finally cracked into what might have been a smile. The other guards not participating in the demonstration were clapping enthusiastically. As the applause died down, the crown prince addressed the audience. He spoke about the value of cultural exchange, but how the best aspects of any culture were those that could grow and adapt while maintaining their essential character. He spoke about the character shown by both Takeshi and Henrik, about how they had transformed a moment of conflict into an opportunity for mutual growth. Then the prince did something unexpected. He called both Takeshi and Henrik forward and presented them each with a special commendation. For Henrik, it was recognition of his dedication to improving his skills in service of the kingdom. For Takeshi, it was honorary citizenship in the kingdom, a rare honor that came with an open invitation to return and continue the work he had begun. The formal ceremony concluded, but the day was far from over. For hours afterward, Takeshi and the guards were surrounded by attendees wanting to ask questions, to understand more about the techniques they had witnessed, to congratulate them on the demonstration. Several military officers requested permission to send members of their units to train with the Royal Guard to learn these new methods. That evening, a farewell banquet was held in Takeshi's honor. The grand dining hall was filled with many of the people he had met during his time at the palace. The Japanese calligrapher, the Italian violin maker, the Persian carpet weaver, and dozens of others came to offer their congratulations and share their own reflections on the cultural exchange. Henrik sat beside Takeshi throughout the meal, and at one point he raised his glass in a toast. He spoke about how a kick to the chest had hurt his body and wounded his pride, but how the days that followed had given him something far more valuable than the pain had taken away. He had learned new skills, yes, but more importantly, he had learned about the courage required to transform failure into growth, to set aside ego in pursuit of deeper understanding. Takeshi responded with his own toast, speaking about how his greatest failure had become his most important teaching experience. He had come to this kingdom to demonstrate his mastery, only to discover that true mastery required more than technical skill. It required wisdom, humility, and the ability to find opportunity even in the most difficult circumstances. The next morning, as Takeshi prepared to depart, Henrik and the captain of the guard came to his quarters. They brought with them a gift from all the guards who had trained with him. It was a sword, not a ceremonial piece, but a training sword, worn smooth by years of use. On the hilt was an engraving in both Takeshi's language and the kingdom's language. It read, "Strength and wisdom grow from unexpected moments." The farewell at the palace gates was emotional. Takeshi had arrived at this kingdom alone, a celebrated master of his art. He was leaving with friends, with a deeper understanding of his own discipline and with the knowledge that the most important lessons sometimes come from the places we least expect. As his car pulled away from the palace, Takeshi looked back one final time. Henrik and the other guards stood at attention, offering a formal salute. Takeshi returned the gesture, his hand raised to his heart in the traditional sign of respect from his art. The palace slowly disappeared from view, but Takeshi knew he would return. He had been given honorary citizenship, yes, but more than that. He had been given something he had not known he was seeking. Proof that the true path of mastery never ends, and that every setback contains the seeds of growth for those brave enough to cultivate them. Years later, when students at his dojo asked about his time in the European kingdom, Takeshi would tell them this story. He would describe the moment of impact, the fear and uncertainty that followed, and the extraordinary transformation that emerged from what seemed like disaster. He would tell them that the sharpest kick he ever delivered taught him his most important lesson, that mastery is not about perfection, but about how we respond when things go wrong. The bruise he left on Henrik's chest had faded within weeks, but the connection forged in the aftermath would last a lifetime. And that, he would tell his students, was the true meaning of the martial arts.